Okay, I think we are live now. Let's see who's coming in. Okay. Oh, Dana, this is wonderful. Emma, Chris, Kathleen, this is just a wonderful turnout. Thank you all so much for coming. This is lovely. Great to see you, Danielle. Wonderful. Ah, my favorite moment when it all is real. Okay. I am B. Ruby Rich. I'm the editor of Film Quarterly. Welcome all of you to our Page Views webinar, which we do with every issue based on the book that Bruno Guaraná has chosen for Page Views, and based on the conversation he has initiated with the author. We're going to get into the conversation. I'm here to moderate. I will jump in once in a while, but we like to begin by having Bruno tell you a bit about the book before the conversation starts. Bruno, it's on you now.
While it has acknowledged and even focused on a narcotic form of spectatorship, film theory has tended to look at the state of sleepiness with suspicion. When it has employed the construct of a narcotic spectator, as Jean discusses, film theory absorbed by this awesome powers of cinema, film theory has done so as a cautionary tale, calling out the ideological operations of the cinematic apparatus. In such theories, spectators must resist the temptations and pleasures of cinema, lest they be, to put somewhat bluntly, brainwashed by it. But Jean argues instead that a critically awakened viewing practice is not a necessary correction to the somnolence induced by cinema. She challenges this notion by framing sleep positively. In her view, somnolence is already a form of emancipation from the traps of cinema, restoring agency to the spectator. And as it turns out, to sleep or to linger on at the edges of sleep is to reclaim one's autonomy as a spectator, to reconfigure the terms of spectatorship, and to selectively and critically engage with the cinematic experience. So to formulate this kind of a spectatorship, Jean pays special attention to the texts themselves and to their conditions of reception. And it is here that Thai filmmaker Apichatpong Weerasethakul becomes a key figure in her book. Throughout the book, she continually returns to his work in cinema and in audiovisual installations and their embrace of sleep. As she demonstrates, Apichatpong is not only interested in portraying sleepy or sleeping characters, but also ostensibly inducing sleepiness in his spectators. In fact, when introducing screenings of his own films, he often leaves the stage wishing to viewers, quote, asleep with good dreams, unquote. This is an apparent contradiction, inviting viewers to watch a film of his own, but to do so without the demand for attention. But the suggestion here is that the best way to experience Apichatpong's work may indeed be in a sleepy state, which we viewers inhabit to reconstruct the film by filling the gaps produced by our own sleepiness, contribute to the film as much as the author has. It is also through Apichatpong that Jean detects and theorizes the kind of cinema she calls circadian. For Jean, characterizing Apichatpong's work as a slow cinema may be missing the point, for slow cinema still calls for an active spectator whose concentration and focused attention are imperatives for an ideal viewing experience. Circadian cinema, best exemplified by art installations that offer viewers the space and the conditions for them to sleep during extremely long screenings, do just the opposite. In other words, they invite sleep as part of the film experience. This, of course, has many implications, right? But I'll call attention to one of the ones, to the one I find most fascinating. In an age in which cinema has quickly moved to more private and domestic spaces, circadian cinema, in Jean's words, makes a bid for the survival of cinema as a communal experience. And I find this a little paradoxical, or perhaps too risky, right? Because it seems that the survival in future cinema today are in the hands of a spectator who, like me last night, couldn't help but fall asleep. So with that said, I will turn to Jean with two questions to begin with. The first one is how well she slept last night, and the second one is how this project came into being. What's the origin of it?
How she slept last night. Go, Jean.
Thank you, Bruno, for that lovely introduction, and also for your amazing work at Page Views. It's truly a gift to have a reader and interlocutor like you. So to answer your first question, not very well. I think that being a bad sleeper having difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep. It is partly what got me onto the topic of sleep. I take a great deal of interest in every kind of article in the paper about the latest findings of sleep science, about, new gadgets, tools that will help you to sleep better. I read all of those things with great interest in the hope of improving my own sleep, which I'm sure more than a few people on this webinar can probably relate to that. And I think it was the kind of being immersed in this, sleep literature that is emerging, I think has emerged and at this really explosive rate in the last few years. Being immersed in that at the same time that I watched Apichatpong Weerasethakul Cemetery of Splendor is really how the book came together. So it's a book on a large topic, but it started in a very specific place. I saw Cemetery of Splendor, when it came out in movie theaters. This was 2016 in the winter, and there was just something that struck me about this film in which we understand the characters to be not awake for a good part of the story. It's a film about disordered sleep. It actually takes inspiration from real news reports in northern Thailand about a group of soldiers who came down with a mysterious sleeping sickness. And that news report becomes the premise for a story that is, I think, in many ways responding to actual events in the world. But yeah, this film about sleep disorder and the sense that things are very still and quiet because so many of the characters are asleep, and yet there's so much happening below the surface, beyond the frame. So much is intimated beyond what the film actually shows. So I kind of found myself haunted by the film. I kept watching it. It became a paper, which eventually became a book. And I think at the moment I realized this was a larger project was when I started to see certain connections that could be made between the film's story, between Apichatpong's treatment of sleep, and this proliferation of discourses about sleep that, I was finding myself awash in beyond the film.
Right, and I'll piggyback on that. You say the project is so large, in fact, that your corpus seems to attempt to cover everything. One of the things that I found most surprising about the book is when you go back to the history of cinema to look at iterations of sleep in cinema, right? Images of sleep. And as you say, the moment you start looking for images of sleep, you find them everywhere. Can you talk a little bit about how you sort of came to the corpus for the archive of films that you address in the book, whether those originated your focus or they came out once you had the focus and really started looking for it?
Yeah, it is true that when you start to look for sleep, you find it everywhere. It's a bit counterintuitive. I think it's very easy to equate sleep with a kind of the dead time of non-action, non-happening, non-event. But in fact, it's everywhere in cinema. And at some point I realized, thinking about early cinema, that, a huge number of films begin with a character preparing for bed, lying down, closing their eyes, and then the film begins. So it's a trope in early cinema. Think of all of the films by Georges Méliès that have the words dream or nightmare in their title. Yeah. So it is one of these things, you look, you find it everywhere. And even when sleep is not the main theme of the film, as it is in the case of Cemetery of Splendor, there's so many moments of, characters lying down, closing their eyes, and the action pauses so that something else and another key can unfold. So it's a matter of, not just finding sleep everywhere when you don't expect to, but also kind of holding a magnifying glass up to these moments of sleep that have such a charged, important place in many films. One of the things I did was go back to The Wizard of Oz, a film that most of which takes place in the interval of Dorothy's unconsciousness, and really look at the transition when Dorothy is hit on the head, passes out, and then that paves the way for the shift from Kansas to Oz. But yeah, there are moments like this, which in fact have a very overdetermined significance as moments of passage, of crossing a threshold. I came upon Anne Carson's essay, beautiful essay about sleep. Every exit is an entrance. That's the title of her piece. And I realized that this is often how sleep functions in the history of movies. Sleep is an exit that sets us up for an entrance into another realm. Things pause so that another set of forces can kind of take over and propel the action, the story, the movement of the interior movement of sleep in a way becomes the movement of the narrative in so many of these works. So yeah, that's an example of, how once I started looking, there were so many places where sleep could be found. And I think at a certain point, several people asked, well, is this a book about sleep, or is it a book about Apichatpong? Is it a monograph? Right. And I felt that the answer had to be both. I couldn't come down on one side or the other. I might have written a kind of, book about sleeping throughout the history of movies with a kind of cyclopedic aspiration. I think I would, if I had gone that route, maybe I would still be working on the book now. And it also became clear to me that the way I was thinking about sleep was so informed by the process of watching and rewatching so many of his works. It's like his body of work became the lens through which I was thinking about sleep. And that lens was what was kind of, bringing that topic into visibility for me. So these things really couldn't be separated. So yeah, I think the challenge of the writing was to maintain that focus and to go deep into Apichatpong's body of work, including not only his narrative feature films, but also, short works, installations, to maintain that focus, but also to spread outwards as far as, my readings and viewings were taking me. So yeah, I would say the book is both about him, about sleep. It is maybe located at the tension of the kind of point of tension between a kind of a centrifugal approach that moves broadly and widely through film history, as well as, a number of other places where sleep manifests, but also, maintaining a kind of focus and following the thread of a body of work.
Yeah, and I think the book does exactly that, right? Both expands beyond his work, but also returns to it continually in a very effective way. I have, I think, a parallel question is also the structure of the book. I would actually say that the book is both about images of sleep in cinema and about inducing sleep in spectators, right? But your book, I think, has 11 short chapters, and none of them is called introduction or conclusion, which is very, what's what I'm looking for, refreshing to see. So tell us a little bit about this strange but very exciting structure for your book.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bruno. It is, it does have an unusual structure. So at a certain point, it became clear to me that on the one hand, I wanted to think about images, like sleeping characters on the screen, images of sleep, how this more representational aspect, which I think is actually more than just representation, but sleep on the screen, let's say. And then, because of a work like, let's say a work like Sleep Cinema Hotel. So this is actually the example with which I begin the book. Sleep Cinema Hotel is an installation by Apichatpong that includes a 20-hour-long found footage film, including many images and scenes of sleep, a montage made from early cinema, drawn largely from film archives in the Netherlands. It's an installation that includes in the space a platform of beds where audience members could actually lie down and go to sleep and spend the night with the images. So, another part of the book deals with sleep as, in fact, a part of the spectator's experience. And, working on that part led me to think about, not just the history of portraying sleep in the movies, but also how sleep has always been understood to be a kind of inevitable or inextricable part of the film audience's experience. This is true, when I started to, another place where I couldn't avoid the topic of sleep was just going back and reading, film theory, film criticism, and finding again and again this question coming up of whether the film audience is fully awake. There's just a voluminous, history of discussions of debates about spectatorship that raise this question. Is the audience fully conscious? Have they been hypnotized by the image on the screen? And throughout the entire 20th century. So in collecting this, I realized there is this, the idea of film spectatorship is haunted by this kind of concern and doubt about their wakefulness. I call this the discourse of narcotic reception. So I began to track this. The second half of the book speaks to this, and it became very interesting to think about this history and try to place it into dialogue with contemporary works like Sleep Cinema Hotel that are actually inviting the audience to fall asleep and are, creating the conditions in which it is very likely that will happen, by providing them with a kind of very comfortable horizontal apparatus of reception, but also with a long duration of the work that includes the overnight hours when, our bodies are kind of shutting down and preparing for rest anyway. I was also struck that, we see this not only in installations, moving image installations like Sleep Cinema Hotel and some of the others that I discuss in the book, but in fact, there are many, in so many works of contemporary art, performance, theater, and music, we're seeing a turn to this, circadian mode of exhibition. So the invitation to sleep is, I think, I see it as a kind of trend in the contemporary art world too. And in the first chapter of the book, I talk about many different examples, from the concert hall to Performa, the performance art biennial, and a host of other works by contemporary artists like Shuli Chang, Marina Abramovic, so on.
I'm going to pipe in from my little square up at the top. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Annie. To just say, it's interesting what you're describing, because in a way you're resituating sleep from being a cause of shame or a sign of damning boredom into an honorable way to interact with a text, or a way that's being invited, at least by the likes of Apichatpong. So I wondered, did your own feelings about sleep or your own judgments about the sleeping spectator change as you worked on this book?
I did, and my own view changed, and I was hoping to change the view of any readers who might feel shame about
It
sleep.
worked on
And
me, yeah.
Yeah.
but I also think that there's a real sea change in the way that sleep is perceived in, in the scientific community, in academic discourse, in popular discourse. I think for a long time, sleep was seen as in a suspicious way.
Mhm.
It is
As a
something
flaw,
to fight against. It's an unwanted interruption, something that detracts from the value producing activities of the waking hours. I think the entire history of modernity is founded on a kind of somnophobia. And we can kind of go into the kind of the historical and like philosophical and economic roots of this, but the denial of sleep, and the attempt to compress it into as brief of an interval as possible and to fight it, I think, is really deeply embedded in Western, especially in Western industrial modernity. And I think one of the reasons, sleep is so much in the air now is that there is a very fundamental reevaluation of sleep, a desire to understand it more, a kind of reevaluation, and reevaluation. One of the things I did while working on this book was actually to audit a sleep science class at Stanford. It's a class called Sleep and Dreams. Apparently, it's the single most popular class among undergrads. I think everybody takes it as a rite of passage. William Dement started teaching it many decades ago. It was co-taught by him and his colleague, Rafael Pelayo, who runs Stanford's Sleep Study Center. But taking that class was a chance to really learn about kind of, new understandings of sleep that have proliferated in the era of neurophysiology, using the tools of EEG, and kind of mapping all of the activity that actually is in fact taking place in our brains and our bodies while we are asleep. So this notion of sleep as a kind of dead, wasted time is, in the process of being refuted in science. And I think that that refutation is maybe rippling throughout the world of art. Maybe all of these contemporary works that are inviting sleep are, and seem to be interested in the aesthetic or poetic potential of sleep, is a kind of reflection of this shifting attitude. Another place where we see sleep being discussed is in, there's a new field in academic studies called critical sleep studies, to which, the history of literature, sociology, anthropology, and art history have contributed very actively. So I think there's a real, kind of multifaceted rethinking of sleep. And I wanted to tap into this in the process of writing this book, to think about how sleeping in the cinema could contribute to this discourse. So yeah, that, and I think that I found that, the people who I, spoke to in the process of presenting this book, discussing it with colleagues at various institutions, I think everybody who spends a lot of time watching movies and loves cinema has their own stories about falling asleep in the movies. So I think it's actually the cinephile's secret and the cinephile's pleasure. And it was really great to hear those stories in the course of writing this book, and to realize that, some of my own most memorable and pleasurable experiences have been in screenings where I was asleep for a good part of the time.
Well, I had other things I wanted to ask, and you probably do also, Bruno, but Dana Polans has posted a great interjection and question here, and I think we should turn to it since we're halfway through our session. I want to let everybody know it's fine to start posting any comments or questions. But Dana says it's a terrific book. In terms of shame, he says he has a question about returning or not to a film that one fell asleep at.
Mhm.
Dana says he fell asleep as an undergrad at a screening of Bertolucci's Spider Stratagem. Some part of me, says Dana, would like to return to the film to apologize to it. Some part of me feels a guilt that makes it hard for me to return to it. So his question is about shame and about making up for it after the fact. And I think we're now into the letters from the lovelorn. So, Jean, do you have any advice for Dana about the shame he's carrying about Spider Stratagem and what to do with that?
I don't think the film would be mad at you, Dana, for
Yeah.
falling asleep. I think it would be interesting to revisit it. Actually, it reminds me of one of the stories that a friend told me about about falling asleep. I know a lot of people fall asleep in Apichatpong's films. There's something about them that has that effect. I've heard this from multiple people, and Apichatpong himself says, "I don't mind at all if you fall asleep in my films. In fact, you might get something more out of them if you do." But one story was of a friend who was trying to watch Cemetery of Splendor on DVD and basically spent an entire summer to finally watch the film in its entirety, because every night he would fall asleep. He would try again a few nights later. And my response to that was, well, as a result of this, actually, you spent your summer with that film. It became a part of your life. In a way, you had a much more intensive, intimate, and prolonged viewing experience than if you had just watched it from beginning to end wide awake. It became woven into the rhythms of the days throughout that summer. I think that's an example of how, if we think about sleep as not something antithetical to the definition of having watched a film, it kind of opens up the ways, the range of ways we can relate to it. Where does the viewing experience begin and where does it end? I think that anecdote really highlights that question. And for me, it reminds me that, some of my most vivid memories of films are of the fragments that I glimpsed briefly in the middle of a nap. And something about waking up and, watching that fragment, it burned it into my brain in a way that didn't happen with the films I watched from beginning to end.
So I've asked this question in the print version of the interview, but I think it very much relates to Dana's question here. And that was, I often think about how to address my students with this as well. But how does one write? You set yourself up for this very challenging project, but how does one write and think about and study the films that they have fallen asleep to?
Yeah, I kind of tackled that question there's a section of the book that is, I guess it's like an auto theory of sleepy spectatorship. I write in the first person about my own experience of spending the night in Sleep Cinema Hotel. And how experiencing that work for the entirety of its duration forced me to really reflect on my own habits as a spectator, my own efforts to pay really close attention, to watch in a very concentrated way, to take very thorough notes on what I saw. That is kind of my default mode. And, just having gone to that work, it forced me to really reflect on those and to ask about my investment in them. And it forced me to let go, because there was no way I could have sustained that kind of approach for the whole 20 hours. So yeah, that's a section where sort of, letting myself sleep, but also reporting on it and reflecting, not just on the work that I was therefore experiencing, but just on my own kind of habitus as a spectator with a certain stake in a kind of expert mode of viewing, let's say. That was very illuminating, and I think it kind of dislodged something. That the process of writing about that dislodged something and kind of helped me to understand exactly what it was that I was writing about.
Why did you go ahead?
Go on, Bruno.
I was curious why you attended Sleep Cinema Hotel. Were you already working on the book?
Did you stay in a bunk bed? That's what I wanted to know.
I did. There was a structure built out of, metal frames with beds. They were actually extremely comfortable. The funny thing is that they were positioned in the middle of a very big hall. There were seats in the back of the hall. So those of us on the beds were actually in the sight lines of people who might have been watching from the seats. But something about the way the space was arranged, it was, there were ambient noises, accompanying the film, very reminiscent of the, kind of the sounds of the natural world that you often hear in Apichatpong's films. Those were playing. It was dark. The bed was super cozy. It was actually very comfortable. And yeah, the space was designed in a way that, didn't make you feel self-conscious at all in the situation, even though it was unfamiliar and strange to feel so exposed in the presence of strangers, not something most of us are used to when we're sleeping. But yeah, I went to that exhibition, was at I think it was the 2018 Rotterdam International Film Festival.
Right. Yeah,
No,
that's right.
The 2018.
I think you said so.
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, 2018.
Yeah. So this was actually when at the very beginning point of my work on the book, a friend sent it to me, and it just seemed like a gift that, this was happening. It seemed to so perfectly pick up on the motifs in Apichatpong's films that I had been thinking about. But then, this work that very explicitly was thinking about sleep as a part of the way it designed the experience of the audience. I had to go. So I think in a way maybe that was another moment visiting that work that clarified the structure of the book as, one that would extend from sleep on the screen to sleep within the exhibition space. And that really kind of brought out the experiential dimension as a key part of what I was exploring.
Were you surprised when you saw Memoria with Tilda Swinton, who of course famously once slept in public in a museum and in an art gallery, working with Apichatpong and discovering from perhaps the interviews that the whole theme of her hearing loud noises and not being able to sleep derived from his own inability to sleep? I had so internalized the idea of his growing up around rural hospitals where his parents were doctors, that when I suddenly discovered that he had this weird sleeping disorder of clanging noises, I was really shocked. It was hard to put these two Apichatpongs together for me.
Yeah, it kind of didn't surprise me that somebody who thinks about sleep so deeply would be attuned to the connection between sleep and disorder, illness. In fact, we see those connections in his films. The other detail about that film that I love is Tilda Swinton's character is named Jessica Holland, which is the name of the sleepwalking woman in the Jacques Tourneur film, I Walked with a Zombie. So, sleep is often, scenes of sleep in his work can be very serene and tranquil, but I think sleep is also a kind of unrestful theme as well. It has these other dimensions related to unrest, disorder, haunting, disturbance, and that's what makes it such an interesting, topic. It's such a rich topic in his treatment of it.
I love that sense of that dynamism. We have a few questions here. Do you want to read any of them, Bruno, or do you want me to read them? We have one from Roy Grundman, one from Dennis Sun, and then we have one back again from Dana. So,
I'll read Roy's,
okay.
my colleague Roy's question. Thanks, Roy. Sleep often goes with other body functions such as snoring. Does your book discuss snoring as an epiphenomenon or of circadian spectatorship? Does it have to do with the communal? That would be my concern with sleeping with other people.
Yeah, I didn't discuss snoring in the book, although, you know, I've heard lots of snoring in my own experiences of watching films in theaters. I think, you know, one of the things that interested me about sleep and sleepy spectatorship is that I think that that exploration connects very closely to a turn towards the embodied, corporeal dimensions of film going that were for many years neglected in this discourse that treats film as a kind of purely abstracted visual experience. So yeah, to your question, Roy, I mean, I did think a lot about and draw a lot upon the turn to the body in accounts of spectatorship. I think one of the chapters where, you know, those connections really come to the fore is the chapter about Ouija's photographs of people sleeping in New York movie theaters, mostly in the 1940s. But, you know, I think in, you know, Ouija took, as it turns out, a very large number of people in theaters who did not know that they were being photographed with an infrared, you know, with an infrared flash in the dark. And in that archive of photographs, I think we find an incredible kind of archive, a visual archive of embodied spectatorship in the theater. We see people not just sleeping, but eating, lots of eating, kind of, you know, touching each other, kissing, interacting. There's a sort of very rich, the social and embodied textures of film going stand out so clearly in that body of work. And sleep is certainly a part of this portrait of the film going collective. So yeah, I was thinking a lot about how sleep kind of reminds us of, you know, the body that is always there and mediating the experience of moving images.
I'll just say that that chapter is called A Little History of Sleeping at the Movies, and it is absolutely phenomenal. I was floored by that because you start with like that text that is unexpected, the Ouija photograph, and it just develops into this study of, as you say, the bodies that are inhabiting that cinema, as well as the different social classes that appear and how they're afforded different kinds of sleep. And the movie theater as this equalizer, right? Once everybody falls asleep, everybody's at the same kind of condition of experiencing those movies. So just wanted to highlight that for people who will get a chance to read the book.
I had just noticed that there was some back and forth on social media recently about the programs that someone posted about the Strand Theater in San Francisco back in the day, when they would have triple bills perhaps, and it would just, the lights, someone pointed out that the lights never came up, that it went from one film to the next film to the next, and then the cycle started again without lights ever coming up and without that darkness ever being interrupted. So and they then discussed where it was safe to sit within the cinema, what happened in different rows, and you know, so that was really interesting, a different version, whether it was safe to sleep or not. But here's a question from Dennis' son, a quick question. Dennis says he remembers having the best sleep at a symphony theater. So he wonders if the cinematic complex itself is also sleep inductive, the comfortable seats, the surround sound system, the artificial darkness that helps focusing your attention, all hardwire you towards drowsiness. Hardwire being used in an almost ironic way here, toward drowsiness. What do you think about that? Or feel free, Bruno, to jump in as well with any thoughts you have. Is it the new comfortable theater that's causing this increase in slumber?
I think historically, you know, we have Roland Barthes writing in the 1970s about how, you know, these upholstered seats that allow the viewer to kind of sink in, slump down. The darkness, which is like that of the bedroom. Already, even in the kind of classical theatrical era, it was, movie theaters happened to be very nice places to sleep in. I think something about the anonymity of the space, it's public yet anonymous. It allows people to feel unseen and then perhaps let go of some of the reserve and decorum that we typically, sort of adopt in public spaces. So this, that observation comes up quite a bit in discourses of spectatorship. These days, of course, we have reclining seats. We find them in many, I think, AMC theaters that have a kind of a seat that is more like a lazy boy. The fact that you can purchase alcohol and bring it to your seat with you, maybe that increases the likelihood of snoring in the theater. Although there's great work by Jocelyn Paniat-Galice about how these reclining chairs actually are not such a new thing. They were introduced in the post-war period. And she looks at the advertising for these chairs that actually hold out the idea that the viewer might be so comfortable that they fall asleep. This is seen as something that could attract buyers of the seats. So yeah, there's quite a bit of precedent there.
Great. We have another question from Dana, bringing up drive-in movie culture, saying it would be interesting to consider viewing situations where one is required to sleep. And he says he's thinking about drive-in culture for kids in the 60s, where the drive-in movie theater would show a family-friendly film first, and then the kids were supposed to go into the back seat in order to go to sleep, while the more adult-friendly film would be shown for their parents and presumably for other younger dating couples in the movie theater. So did any thoughts on drive-ins and the way in which sleep was being segmented there for its audience?
I think the minute, there's so many cases of sleeping in the theater. I think quite a bit of the discourse of narcotic reception that I trace assumes that spectatorship means watching a film in a commercial movie theater like those we find in this country, in many places, many, industrialized urban spaces. But I think the minute we kind of open up our definition of exhibition to include a larger assortment of places, we find even more opportunities for sleep, perhaps. So yeah, the drive-in would be one. And, I think cars are often places where, children can fall asleep, kind of soothed by, the motion of the car. I was very interested to read about outdoor film exhibition in many parts of Asia, including rural Thailand. This is a film culture that where the theater experience is cannot be presupposed as a kind of built-in feature of the apparatus. And, for example, in May Adadal Ingawanisha's work on outdoor itinerant film exhibition in Thailand, or in Chen Suzhou's work on outdoor exhibition in socialist China, we actually find the ideal conditions there for circadian cinema because the screening has to begin after dark and continue throughout the night. And in their accounts, we get the sense that many things were going on at these screenings besides people, just sitting and paying attention to the film, including falling asleep because it was late and they were tired. So yeah, I think that maybe thinking about, how sleep can enter the cinema experience really forces us to go beyond, the usual sites of exhibition and think about this broader terrain, whether we're talking about, instances like these outdoor film projections, or maybe even very new apparatuses of exhibition that we find in places like, let's say, Seoul. One of the largest theater chains in the world is CGV, based in South Korea. They have developed something called Temper Cinema. Temper is a reference to the mattress company. So in Temper Cinemas, you find not seats, but beds, and you can rent a bed. They're set up as doubles. And that theater emulates the comforts of watching a movie from your bed. Here's a kind of, ultra modern example of cinema that departs from, the standard dispositive of exhibition.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as you know very well, Tsai Ming Liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn brings up what else can go on in a sleepy cinema, from apparitions to sex to sleep. So it's not a hard line between being awake and being asleep in these settings. I really love that.
There is a sense that the sleepy spectator becomes emancipated, right? How would you say this emancipation takes place, and what is a spectator being emancipated from?
Yeah, I was really interested in this term, this idea of a kind of sleep being a freedom that is offered to the spectator. Actually, Apichatpong uses this word a lot. You are free to sleep. I want to offer the freedom not to pay attention, not to concentrate on what I am showing them. This comes up repeatedly. It struck me as a really fascinating resonance with Jacques Rancière's idea of the emancipated spectator. Can we emancipate the spectator from this interminable project of rousing them to a higher level of agency and critical awareness, which has always been, the project of theater, as Rancière notes, but I think it has always been the project of film theory, which always claims this project of, leading away from the hypnosis of cinema, away from illusions and mystification towards a more critically alert viewing practice. So, sleepy spectatorship throws up a fundamental challenge, this telos and objective. Maybe that's one way to, unfold this idea of emancipation. It also kind of struck me that in some of Bazin's writings about spectatorship, he also he uses these terms, freedom, liberation, in thinking about films that offer the audience a choice of where to put their attention, of where to let their eye wander, rather than imposing on them a kind of interpretive framework that is already built into the image, as it were. So yeah, this is a really, that was a fascinating discourse that I tried to unpack a bit in thinking about sleepy spectatorship, and to ask how these notions of emancipation, how they converge, what are the differences between them, and how we can maybe map that discourse into theories of spectatorship in a way that unsettles this, I think, very, somehow this kind of default opposition between active and passive spectatorship that is so often invoked as structuring polarity in the way that we think about spectatorship. Can these terms and can this embrace of more passive forms of agency, can that allow us to kind of get away from this binary that has held sway for a long time, and I think is surges up again in debates about spectatorship today, as the moving image, is wandering beyond the theater into so many different terrains.
Yeah, on that note, I just want to read out Leona Heimfeld's comment here outside the domain of the movie theater, saying that apparently a significant number of people injure their faces because of falling asleep while watching in bed on their iPad and dropping the device that hits them in the face. So this would be the dangers of the circadian cinema when there's when it hits at the wrong moment. So that's a fanciful comment, but and one now from Ivonette Pinto. What would you say to a film critic, her case, who fell asleep during part of a film and needs to write about it? His analysis would be compromised, right? Would it be honest to reveal to the reader that he slept? And while you think about that as an answer, because I think we're getting close to our last one, I have to say that starting out in film in Chicago in the 1970s, where I was often in screenings with Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, one of them or the other would frequently fall asleep during a film, and I would read their review the next day. So I think this is kind of the open secret of the old days of newspaper reviewing, when you didn't get another chance to go back, you couldn't rewind, and you couldn't say that you couldn't write the review. So I think people did, in fact, devise very, very clever ways of concealing what they had missed.
Yeah, just in response to that, one of the best stories about falling asleep in the movies that I heard was from Jean-Michel Frodon, a film critic, about falling asleep in a film that he wrote a review of that was published in Le Monde. And it turned out to be, I'll just say that it turned out to be one of the best reviews he ever wrote. So do not be discouraged. Yeah.
Oh no, now I want to hear more. Why?
Was he forthcoming about falling asleep, or did he just reveal something about that review that we hadn't known before?
Well, the story was, I don't know that he would necessarily want me to repeat it, but it was not, let's just say that he fell asleep and dreamed the scene that was not in the actual film, but which the director had intended to include.
Lucky, very good. Very good. Well, I mean, one question here would be, is the critic compromised? But I think the other question is, does the critic blame the film for the slumber? So it's like, which side gets blamed, right? Or does neither? Is this a wonderful meeting of minds of sleeping through the film that demands sleep of you? It's a wonderful terrain that you've opened up, Jean. Bruno, Jean, do you want to say anything finally in closing? We've got just a few minutes left, I think 4 minutes. Any last thoughts for the audience who have stayed with us wonderfully for this great conversation?
I'm thinking a lot about the return to the communal aspects of cinema, right, that you have already addressed, even in thinking about people falling asleep with their phones, dropping on their faces. And I think this is sort of like a two-part question, which is which other filmmakers are engaged in what you would call circadian cinemas, and how does circadian cinemas recuperate this communal aspect of moviegoing?
I think that maybe to get at the question from a slightly roundabout way, yeah, maybe watching an iPad in bed is the new smoking in bed. You know, something bad might happen. Fall asleep at an inopportune moment. It actually makes me think of another filmmaker who I think is very engaged with, very attuned to the possibilities of sleepy spectatorship, is Abbas Kiarostami. And one of the really beautiful shots in his final posthumous film, 24 Frames, is of a person asleep at a desk with the last scene of The Best Years of Our Lives playing on a computer screen. Another example of sleeping with a movie, but not in the public space of the theater, in the private space at home. An example of how I think narcotic reception has a very wide terrain. People often fall asleep at home watching movies on the television. And in fact, we have a kind of cultural image of the zonked out TV viewer, kind of passed out on the couch. So this is a figure who is not limited to the theater. But yeah, to get to your question, Bruno, I think that somehow, working on this book really led me, I think part of the challenge of sleepy spectatorship is to open up our understanding of the encounter between viewers and moving images, not to adhere to rigid ideals about spectatorship or concentrated attentiveness, to kind of, maintain a capacious understanding of how movies come to us and how we come to them, and what happens in that encounter. That was really what I wanted. That was what I took to be the challenge of the book, to unsettle some of these rigid definitions. At the same time, in the process of working on the book, I think the communal dimension of film going felt more and more urgent, important to hold on to. This maybe reflects the fact that I was, finishing up the writing during the pandemic, during the lockdown, reading about the closure of movie theaters, from the Castro Theater in San Francisco to the ArcLight chain in Los Angeles. Movie theaters were already endangered places and of public gathering, and we saw that just accelerated, during the lockdown. So that I think the question of the communal part of film going and how sleep kind of sleeping with others highlights something about the nature of that communal experience. Which is very different from having a conversation or being in a seminar together.
Right.
I think that kind of became the urgent note on which the book concludes.
Great. I'm going to stop you there because we're at time, Jean, and just read out Elena Gorfinkel's last comment to you, bringing up Serge Denay, the films that watched us, and the tracking shot in Capo. And thank you so much for this. I wish we had another hour with you. Thanks everyone for coming.